When you think of Virginia, you picture colonial mansions, tobacco plantations, and the old white money of the Confederacy's former capital. But a few blocks north of that state capital, a different empire rose, one almost nobody tells you about. We're talking about the families who built the very first Black Wall Street in America, decades before Tulsa. The bankers, the insurance kings, and the woman who turned pennies into a fortune while Jim Crow tried to bury her. This is Richmond's Jackson Ward, the original old money black mecca, and these are the dynasties that ran it. 8. The Southern Aid Dynasty, the men who ensured a race. Let's start with a group of men who looked at the single most brutal fact of black life in the 1890s South, which was that a black family could be wiped out overnight by one illness or one funeral, and decided to build an entire industry to fix it. In February of 1893, less than 30 years after the end of slavery, a handful of men in Richmond chartered the Southern Aid and Insurance Company. And this was not a small thing. It was the first chartered, black-owned, and black-operated insurance company in the entire United States, full stop. At a time when white insurers either refused black customers outright or charged them punishing rates, these men built a company by black people, for black people, run out of Jackson Ward. Here's how it actually worked, because the genius is in how small it started. A member paid as little as 5 cents a week. In return, if he got sick, he collected $1.50 a week while he couldn't work, and if he died, his family got $15 to bury him with dignity instead of a pauper's grave. Nickels in, security out, and it caught fire. By 1902, the society had nearly 20,000 paying members, and by 1937, it employed more than 300 black men and women across branches in Virginia and Washington, D.C., pouring its modest profits back into real estate and its own grand headquarters. What people fundamentally misunderstand about the Southern Aid Dynasty is that they weren't just selling policies. They were building the financial floor that everything else in Jackson Ward would be built on top of. You cannot start a business, buy a home, or take a risk if one bad week can ruin your family forever. These men removed that terror for tens of thousands of people, and in doing so, they created the stable, protected middle class that made a Black Wall Street even possible. Their building still stands today, the name carved right into the stone. The company was eventually absorbed by Atlanta Life, but the blueprint they drew, insurance as the foundation of black wealth, got copied clean across the country. The Southern Aid men built the safety net. The next man on this list built the thing that safety net let people finally do, which was borrow, own, and build. 7. The Consolidated Bank lineage, the institution that refused to die. Here's a fact that should stop you cold. While white-owned banks were collapsing like dominoes during the Great Depression, taking the savings of millions of Americans down with them, there was a black-owned bank in Richmond, Virginia that did not just survive, it kept paying out 100 cents on every dollar. That institution became the Consolidated Bank and Trust Company, and it holds one of the most remarkable records in American finance because it went on to become the longest continuously operating black-owned bank in the entire United States, a title it held all the way until 2009. Think about the span of that. This bank outlasted the Depression, 2 World Wars, Jim Crow, and integration. Generations of Richmond families were born, bought homes, started businesses, and died. And through all of it, the same black-owned bank was there holding the money. The power move that created it was a masterstroke of survival. During the worst of the financial crisis around 1930, rather than let the pressure crush the individual black banks of Jackson Ward one by one, the community's financial leaders merged the strongest of them into a single, consolidated institution. They understood something Wall Street forgot, which is that in a storm, you don't stand alone, you stand together. The combined bank had the reserves and the trust to weather what destroyed everyone else. What people fundamentally misunderstand about a bank like this is that it was never really about banking. In a segregated economy, a black-owned bank was the single most powerful weapon a community could hold because it decided which black families got mortgages, which black entrepreneurs got loans, which dreams got funded when every white bank in the city said no. Consolidated didn't just store Richmond's black wealth, it was the engine that manufactured it, decade after decade, quietly, while the rest of the country wasn't watching. That institution was built to outlast everyone. The next man was the brilliant, combative genius who helped write the legal rules that made all of it possible in the first place. Speaking of the kind of mind that rewrites the rules it was handed, a lot of it comes down to how the brain performs when it matters. That's the idea behind an audio series called The Genius Switch. It's based on the neuroscience of the flow state, that mode where focus and creativity click at the same time. And the whole routine is just listening with headphones a few minutes a day. It's a one-time $39, less than a single online course, and it's backed by a 90-day money-back guarantee, so you can test it on yourself with nothing to lose. If you're watching on your TV, pause and scan the QR code on screen with your phone camera, or tap the first link in the description. Now, back to number 6, and the man who put it all on paper. 6. The Giles B. Jackson Dynasty. The lawyer who wrote the blueprint. Every empire needs someone who knows how to work the system from the inside, and in Jackson Ward, that man was Giles Beecher Jackson, who pulled off something in that era that sounds almost impossible. Born enslaved, Jackson became the first African-American attorney ever certified to argue before the Supreme Court of Appeals of Virginia. Let that sink in. A man who was legally property at birth stood up, in the former capital of the Confederacy, and argued law before the highest court in the state. And he didn't stop at his own career. In 1888, it was Giles B. Jackson who wrote the actual Articles of Incorporation for the Savings Bank of the True Reformers, the document that gave birth to the first black chartered bank in America. The lawyer drew up the papers that launched the whole banking movement. Here's the power move that shows how his mind worked. Jackson understood that legal expertise was itself a form of capital, maybe the most valuable form there was, because in a system designed to strip Black Americans of every right, the man who actually understood the machinery of that system could pry openings in it that no amount of money could buy. He became the go-to architect for Black enterprise, structuring businesses, organizing exhibitions of Black achievement, and lending his legal weight to the institutions rising all around him in Jackson Ward. What people fundamentally misunderstand about a figure like Giles Jackson is that in a courtroom and a segregated economy, knowledge was a harder currency than cash. Anyone could be robbed of their money. It was far harder to rob a man of the ability to read a contract, incorporate a company, and stand toe-to-toe with white attorneys in front of white judges and win. Jackson turned that skill into influence that rippled through every other name on this list. Because behind a shocking number of these institutions, somewhere in the paperwork, was the hand of the formerly enslaved lawyer who knew exactly how to make them legal, permanent, and bulletproof. Jackson built his power out of law and paper. The next man built his out of ink and fury, and he became known all across America as the fighting editor. 5. The Mitchell Dynasty, the fighting editor who banked on rage. John Mitchell Jr. is, for my money, the most electrifying figure in this entire story, because he did something almost nobody in the Jim Crow South dared to do. He printed the truth about lynching, with names, with details, with graphic images, and he dared anyone to come stop him. Born enslaved near Richmond, Mitchell took over a struggling Black weekly called the Richmond Planet in 1884, while he was barely into his 20s, and he turned it into one of the most fearless newspapers in America. He published lists of lynching victims. He personally intervened to stop lynchings, arranged legal counsel for the unjustly convicted, and once wrote that lynching is a barbarous practice that has been outlawed by civilized nations. It must go. He carried a pistol and openly told his readers that a Black man had every right to defend his own life. They called him the fighting editor, and he earned every letter of it. But Mitchell understood that a voice without money can be silenced, so he built himself an economic base. He'd served on Richmond City Council, he rose to Grand Chancellor of the Virginia Knights of Pythias, and in 1901 he founded the Mechanics' Savings Bank. At its peak, right around 1919, that bank held over $500,000 in deposits, an enormous sum for a Black institution at the time, and Mitchell became a genuine power in Black Richmond, even tooling around town in a Stanley Steamer automobile, and once giving Marcus Garvey himself a personal tour of the city. Now here's the part most tributes skip, and I'm going to give it to you straight because it matters. Mitchell's bank did not survive. When the post-war economy turned in the early 1920s, the Mechanics' Savings Bank collapsed, and Mitchell was charged in its failure. His convictions were eventually overturned, but the damage was done, and his influence never fully recovered. What people fundamentally misunderstand about John Mitchell is that this fall doesn't diminish him. It completes him. He was a man who spent a fortune's worth of courage attacking the most dangerous targets in America, and he built real wealth doing it. That the money didn't last forever makes him human, not a failure. The lynchers he defied are forgotten. The fighting editor is carved into history. Mitchell built his empire on the printed word. The next family built theirs on something far more certain than any newspaper, the one appointment every single person is guaranteed to keep. 4. The Price Dynasty, the undertaker who banked the dead. Here is the coldest, most reliable business model in the history of Jackson Ward, and it belonged to a man named A.D. Price, who understood a truth that made him one of the wealthiest black men in Richmond, which is that death never goes out of business. Price built a funeral and undertaking empire in Jackson Ward at a time when even in death, black Virginians were segregated and disrespected, denied dignified burials by white establishments. He gave them that dignity, and he built a fortune doing it, becoming one of the most successful black entrepreneurs in the city. And he was so respected as a businessman that when the struggling Southern Aid Insurance Company needed a leader who could actually make it profitable, it was A.D. Price, described as a prominent banker and businessman, who was brought in to turn it around. The power move here is understanding why the funeral business was the perfect engine for black wealth in this era. It was completely recession-proof and completely segregation-proof. White competitors weren't fighting for this market. The customer base was utterly loyal because burying your loved ones with respect is not a luxury you skip. And crucially, a successful undertaker sat on steady, predictable cash flow, which he could then plow into real estate and other ventures across the ward. Death funded the living. What people fundamentally misunderstand about a figure like A.D. Price is that the funeral home was never just a funeral home in these communities. It was a bank, a social institution, and a pillar of stability all at once. The black undertaker was often the richest, most trusted man in the neighborhood, the one who extended credit, owned property, and quietly financed other people's dreams. Price took the one certainty of human life and turned it into a dynasty, proving that in Jackson Ward, even the business of endings could become the foundation of a fortune. Price built his wealth on life's one certainty. The next man built his the way empires have always been built, by being the first to open the doors nobody else could. 3. The Tansel Dynasty, the doctor who opened a bank in his own home. Some men on this list built banks in grand halls. Dr. Richard F. Tansel built one in his living room, and it tells you everything about the do-it-yourself genius of Black Richmond. Tansel was a physician, already a rare and prestigious achievement for a black man in the late 1800s. But healing bodies wasn't enough for him. In 1896, he founded the Nickel Savings Bank, and for years he ran it right out of his own home in Richmond's East End. People literally called it Dr. Tansel's Bank. Picture that for a second. A black doctor, seeing patients by day, and running a chartered savings bank out of his house, giving his neighbors a safe place to put their nickels when no white bank in the city would treat them with respect. The power move was the sheer audacity of doing two elite professions at once, and understanding that in a segregated world, a black community needed to grow its own everything, its own doctors, its own bankers, and if you could be both, you became a one-man institution. Tansel's bank started small and stayed careful, but it endured, and it later evolved into the People's Bank, continuing to serve Richmonders for years. He wasn't chasing the biggest fortune in the ward. He was building resilience, one careful deposit at a time. What people fundamentally misunderstand about a man like Richard Tansel is that this stacking of roles wasn't scattered ambition, it was strategy. In a community locked out of the mainstream economy, the most valuable people were the ones who could wear three hats, and Tansel wore all of them: doctor, banker, and pillar. He proved you didn't need a marble headquarters or 100,000 members to matter. Sometimes all you needed was a house, a charter, and the nerve to open your own front door for business. Tansel built his bank in a house. The next man built the single largest black-owned building in the entire city, and he did it while founding the first black chartered bank in the history of the United States. 2. The Brown Dynasty, the founder of black banking in America. If this were a story about firsts, and in many ways it is, then Reverend William Washington Brown would sit at the very origin of all of it, because this formerly enslaved man founded the first black chartered bank in the history of the United States. Brown was born into slavery on a Georgia plantation in 1849, escaped as a young man, fought for the Union, educated himself, and became a minister. And he arrived in Richmond around 1880 with a single burning idea that black Americans would never be free until they controlled their own money. He transformed a small temperance society called the True Reformers into a genuine business empire. And on March 2, 1888, the True Reformers received a state charter for a bank, making the savings bank of the Grand Fountain of the United Order of True Reformers the first black chartered bank in America. It opened right in Brown's own home in Jackson Ward, and its first day's deposits totaled $1,269. Now here is the scale of what he built, because it is genuinely staggering for the era. During the financial panic of 1893, when banks across the country were locking their doors, Brown's Bank was the only bank in all of Richmond to stay fully open, honoring every check and paying every account in full. The order built True Reformers Hall, the largest building owned by black people in the entire city, constructed entirely by black hands, containing a bank, offices, stores, and a concert hall. They owned a hotel that hosted 150 guests, a newspaper, a general store, and a home for the elderly. By 1906, their real estate department alone owned 27 buildings and 3 farms, worth around $400,000, which is roughly $14 million in today's money. And at one point, Brown sold his copyrighted plans for the organization back to the order for $50,000, an almost unimaginable sum for a black man in the 1890s. What people fundamentally misunderstand about William Washington Brown is that he wasn't just an entrepreneur, he was the source code. Every bank, every fraternal insurance society, every penny savings model that followed in Richmond, including the one we're about to close with, traces its DNA back to what this formerly enslaved preacher proved was possible. He showed an entire race, 40 years out of bondage, that they could charter and run their own bank, and do it better and more honestly than the white banks failing all around them. He died in 1897, and his funeral was one of the largest black Richmond had ever seen. The bank itself eventually collapsed in 1910, but the idea he unleashed was already unstoppable, because one of the people watching and learning was a young woman who would take his blueprint and become the most famous of them all. Brown proved a formerly enslaved man could found a bank, but the woman at the center of this final story took that proof and shattered a ceiling nobody in America had ever broken. 1. The Walker Dynasty, the woman who turned pennies into an empire. Maggie Lena Walker was born in 1864 in Richmond, in the mansion where her mother worked as a formerly enslaved laundress. She once said she was not born with a silver spoon in her mouth, but with a laundry basket practically on my head. And that woman, that daughter of a washerwoman, became the first black woman in American history to charter a bank and serve as its president. She did it in 1903 with the St. Luke Penny Savings Bank, born out of the same fraternal society model Brown had pioneered. And her vision was pure and radical. "Let us put our monies together," she said. "Let us have a bank that will take the nickels and turn them into dollars." She meant it literally. She handed out little cardboard boxes to the children of Jackson Ward so they could save their pennies, and when a child saved up a single dollar, they could open a real bank account. She was teaching an entire generation to build wealth before they could even drive. And the results were extraordinary. Her bank financed hundreds of black home and business loans. By 1920, she claimed the bank had helped 645 black families completely pay off their homes, actually own the roof over their heads, in the Jim Crow South. She ran a newspaper and a department store alongside the bank. She was the largest employer of black women in Richmond. And when the Great Depression came for everyone, Maggie Walker did what the great ones on this list did. She merged her bank to survive, folding it into the consolidated bank and trust that we opened this whole story with. The circle closes on her. She expanded her Jackson Ward home to 28 rooms, and it still stands today as a National Historic Site, preserved with her family's original furniture, because the Walkers held on to that home until 1979. What people fundamentally misunderstand about Maggie Walker is that she was not an exception to the men on this list. She was their culmination. Everything Jackson Ward had been building for a generation, the insurance floor, the banking blueprint, the legal architecture, the fighting spirit, all of it flowed into this one woman in a wheelchair, disabled in her later years by paralysis, who ran a financial empire from her home and never once stopped fighting for her people. She didn't just break the glass ceiling for Black women in American finance. She proved that the whole Jackson Ward experiment, the audacious idea that Black Americans could bank themselves into freedom, actually worked. Today, there's a 10-foot bronze statue of her standing in the center of Richmond, holding a checkbook, exactly where an old money mecca once turned pennies into power. And those were the dynasties of Jackson Ward, the first Black Wall Street in America, decades before anyone said the words out loud. Notice the pattern running through every single one of them. They didn't wait for permission, or for a white bank to say yes, or for the country to grant them a fair shot that was never coming. They built the whole machine themselves, the insurance, the banks, the law, the press, from pennies and nickels and sheer refusal. Much of what they built was later strangled by the Depression, by redlining, by an interstate highway the city rammed straight through the heart of the neighborhood. But the proof they left behind is permanent. A formerly enslaved preacher, a washerwoman's daughter, a fighting editor, and a doctor with a bank in his living room built an old money Black Mecca in the capital of the Confederacy, and they did it in plain sight. To keep uncovering the hidden history of Black wealth in America, like this video and subscribe to Black Status.